Hello again, everyone. This video will be a tutorial for helping you to complete homework in the Pallant textbook for Chapter 4, where you're learning how to create data files and enter data. This will prepare you for when you have your own data, if you need to create a data file from scratch. It'll also give you some experience using the data editor as well as the variable view on SPSS to change how your variables are set up, what order they're in, and so on. My tutorial is really going to focus on the second part of the homework where you're actually working with SPSS to build your own data set. So this time around, since we're not opening existing data file, what we want you to be able to do is to start from scratch and open an empty data file. I need to open SPSS just raw without going from a file first. Now, just like with the last tutorial, I am on the VPN because I'm recording from home. You will need to access SPSS either in a lab or through the VPN yourself. What I want to do here is to select the option for creating a new data set. Now, once you've been working with SPSS for a while, it will store other things that you've worked on if you're working on your own machine. If you're working on one of the desktops or the virtual desktops on campus, it will not. So for the purposes of this homework, I want you to open a new data set. So you highlight new data set and then you click open. And what you have is, and you'll notice that in the background, that thing that popped up, every time you open SPSS, it's going to open an output file that will store pretty much anything you do. So what this says here is new file. I just opened a new file. And data set. Name data set. Because I haven't saved it yet. I haven't saved it as anything at this point. But this processor, or not processor, this output file is always going to be lurking in the background. And it will record a record of everything that you do as you work. All right, so what you've got here is an open, empty data file. If you were building something from scratch, let's say you had collected some survey data on paper from a bunch of people, and you wanted to enter that into SPSS, and you knew what the survey looked like, you know what the response options were in the survey. For example, if we look at the survey.save questionnaire, which I've provided for you, it's also in the back of your textbook. You have questions such as sex, which, you know, if we were designing this survey now, we would probably change those options so that there were more options. We'll discuss that more at a later time. But you've got sex with 2 options, male and female. You have age, where people are being asked to put in a number. You have marital status with 8 options. You have whether or not you have children living at home with you. It's a yes/no question. Highest level of education. And you notice on this particular version, this was data collected in Australia, so they use terminology more consistent with their culture. So primary school instead of elementary school, secondary school instead of high school, or middle school, and then high school, and so on and so on. They had people give open-ended responses to sources of stress, which were then coded into the categories that are represented in the data file that you've been using. So what I've asked you to do in the homework, as it says here, I want you to look in the back of your SPSS survival manual on page 339 and look at the code book. In this document, what I mean by the code book is this, the code book for survey.save, which indicates the variable name in SPSS, a full variable name, and then the response options that people could choose from when they were responding to the survey. And that's done for each of the scales making up the the demographic items and the scales making up the survey. So I've asked you to use the code book to set up your own data file from scratch. There are procedures outlined for you in Chapter 4, pages 31 to 33. I asked you to use the first 6 variables listed in the code book, so that would be identification number, sex, age, marital status, children at home, and highest level of education to set up the code, to set up the variables in a new data set. And then what you're going to do is, after you've set it up, you're going to, enter your own responses to those questions as a new data set, and then I'm going to have you save it. All right, so the first step is you're going to toggle over to variable view, and we're going to start with our first variable, which, if you remember from the code book, the first variable was identification number. The variable name for SPSS, remember the rules, it can't have spaces, it can't have numerals in the first position and things like that. So what you shoot for in a variable name is something short but clear for you. And then any coding instructions that need to be entered. So our first one is identification. So let's say you wanted to call it ID in variable view. Now the type is going to be numeric. You have options here. Pretty much, anytime my students are entering something, unless they have a real specific reason for using, say, currency or scientific notation, you're going to use numeric, and that's in fact why it is the default. The width, the decimals, since it's an ID number, there is no need for decimals, so you can set that to 0. The label can be, you type that out so that when you have output files or output to read, having the label means that you're not reading an abbreviated name for a variable that's hard for you to clarify. Now in this case, we don't need to enter a type of variable because it's just an identification number. We're not going to use it in data analysis. Now the next variable, and for whatever reason I like to have my variable names in all caps. You can do whatever you choose in that respect. So sex is the next. I'm still entering the values in a numeric form. This is not a variable, though, that is a quantitative variable. It's a qualitative variable. I don't need any decimal points. So I take that off. And let's say I want it to be more clear or give a longer title. I could call it participant sex. Now in this case there are values. So if you remember the code book, we go back down and look at our code book. The full variable name sex, the SPSS variable name, and then you have codes, because we assign, even categorical variables get assigned numbers. So we have 1 representing males, 2 representing females. Again, if we were writing this survey ourselves, we would not use just 2 binary options. We would provide other options as well. But since we're working with the data that we have, we're going to stick with their options right now. So in the value box, you put the number 1. In the label box, you put what it represents. Then we go back, we have to get the other ones. So for females, they're going to be coded as 2s. So once you've inserted them, and notice the process I took there, I put the number in the value box, the label in the label box, and then I had to click the add button. Once I've got all of my values inserted, I click OK. Now in this case, this is a qualitative variable. So the scale in SPSS is going to be nominal because you're naming. So I took French in high school. Nom means name. So I always remember nominal variables. They just name things. into category groups, and they're not in a particular order, and there's no numerical meaning to the ones and the twos. They're just category labels. So I designate it as a nominal variable. Now my next variable is age. Again, I just have a habit of using all caps for my variable names. It's going to be numeric. Now I could, if I wanted to be super precise about age, have decimal points, but I typically do not. The participant age is how I might want to label it. Now in this case, there are no values. The data is going to be an actual number that represents the person's age in years. Then in this case, the type of variable that you actually have in SPSS terminology is a scale variable. Age is a numeric variable where you're using a scale of measurement that theoretically you could be 0 years old, all the way to, 100 and whatever, if you're sincerely long-lived. So it's a scale variable. The distance between 1 year and 2 years is the same as the distance between 30 years and 31 years, with more arthritis. So it's a scale variable. Now with marital status, which is our next variable, and you can make these fairly long as there aren't spaces. It's still going to be numeric. The decimals have no meaning. Yes, I'm a bit perfectionistic. Now here, there are lots of options for marital status. So, looking at the original ones in the back of your book, 1 was identified as single, and you can see how each time you're adding using the add button. 2 represents in a steady relationship. Thankfully, this is not, Facebook, where you can choose. It's complicated. Yeah, just a little data entry humor. Now these are the author of the original studies categories, not mine. Just a reminder. And they were using a subject population that was not college students, so they were looking at a much more broad group of potential participants who had a range of marital statuses. And finally, 8. So there. Now let's say you needed to change something. Let's say this was wrong. I could remove it by using the remove button, and there wasn't anything wrong with it, so I'm going to put it back. Let's say that I wanted to, oops, I forgot to do add. Now I've messed up completely. That's what happens when you get a little click happy, right? Now let's say I wanted to remove something. I could remove it, or I could add a new one. that back in. So there it is. Now let's say I wanted to change something. That's a little trickier. You basically you have to remove it and then add it in order to alter the things that you already entered. You click OK. Now this is another nominal variable because they are discrete categories. There's no indication that they're in any particular order, and they don't measure anything numerically. So it's a nominal variable. Our fifth variable that we're looking at is whether you have a child in the home. We're still going to code it numerically. There's no need for decimal points. Now this is an example. I've basically given pretty much the entire question as it's written on the survey. Now this is a yes/no question, and they're coding 1 is yes, and 2 is no. And I click OK. And again, this is a nominal variable because it's a simple category. It's either yes or no. Either you have kids in your house or you don't. But the numbers themselves, the 1s and 2s, I could code them 36 and 47 and it wouldn't make any difference. They're just numerical designators that don't have quantitative meaning. And then our final variable, education level, still going to be numeric, but we don't need the decimal points. And in this case, the question is highest level of education. And the options here, you should be pretty familiar with this now. Some secondary schools. So those are all of the options for education. Now just like with our other nominal variables, but in this case it's highest level and they're in ranked order. So we designate this an ordinal variable because basically it's categories that happen to be in order. They don't have the quantitative value of saying there's an equal distance between them. I mean, kind of think of it literally. Elementary school, depending on where you live, is K through, what, 4th grade? Whereas middle school, it could be, in my local school district, it's divided into 5th and 6th grade in one building and 7th and 8th in another building. And then you have high school, which is 9 through 12. Well, in Australia, that's different. So what my point is you have different numbers of years in each of these categories. So they are in order. From the lowest number of years to the highest, but they're not equidistant from one another. So that's a classic ordinal variable. in this case. Now, what you're asked to do in your homework is kind of play with this by entering your own responses to the questionnaire items. Now, that's just to give you practice entering some data. So I go back to the data view. I'm going to give myself the designation of, this was my track number when I ran track in high school. I'm a 2 because I'm female. I'm seriously old. I'm married. And I've only been married once. So I'm a number 4 there. Do I have children living at home? That's a tricky one. I have an offspring living at home, but that offspring is 18, but I'm just going to say yes. On that, my highest level of education is postgraduate, so I'm a 6. So you can see how you would enter raw data. Now, if we went on and looked at some of these other things, you just would continue across the top, entering the person's responses on the survey that they were giving. Now, sometimes you may make a decision. The original designations for school, maybe you decide 6 categories is too many. You might want to reframe that, and in a later chapter you're shown how to do what's called recoding, where you could reduce that to 2 categories or 3 categories or some other number that makes sense to you as a researcher. You might want to do that if, say, your sample, you just have too many, you don't have enough in some categories and you have more in other categories, and it makes more sense to split them in a different way than you originally designated. So you might make that decision later. Now, what I've asked you to do in your homework as your next thing is, this time you're not saving the output file, you're saving the actual data file. Remember this thing I described for you, a really ancient looking floppy disk, which none of you have ever touched, one, I would wager. We were using them in the 90s. Well, we don't use them anymore. So how do you save your data set? You go to File and Save As, and it brings up the same dialog box that we saw in homework 3. Now this time I'm working on my own computer, so SPSS remembers where I stored my last file, and you can see it here from my last tutorial. I saved my output file in the same folder that had the survey.save file in it. Now I could change this if I wanted to by the same procedure that I did the last time. Choosing the folder in OneDrive that I want stuff to be in, and then I could go to my homework folder, and in this case I've asked you to name the file my data, and it's automatically going to put the .sav for save file, and that's what SPSS calls data files, to store raw data. And I'm going to hit save. Now when I go back to my my OneDrive, sorry, I have lots of folders, and I open my homework folder, what you'll see in that homework folder, I have the SPV file, the output file that I created in the tutorial for homework 3, and now I have the data file that I've asked you to create for homework 4. Before I conclude here, the remainder of the homework, the first part of homework 4, the chapter 4 homework, is asking you to do some more exploring of options, and the instructions for those are very straightforward. So I'm not giving you a tutorial on those things. I wanted to walk you through the data entry process and the creation of variables process in this tutorial. So that concludes my video for your Chapter 4 Pallant homework.